A criminal remains a criminal, whether he uses a convict suit or a monarch's crown. Victor Hugo. As a person who likes to spend a lot of time monitoring things, which I read a few days ago was a male trait, and would like to stridently protest such characterization, to say that there has been a century's worth of events in the first 2 months of 2026 is probably an understatement. I have even downloaded the almost 1,400 predictions made by Psychic Nikki in order to cross-reference events as they happen. Either she front-loaded her predictions or we really haven't seen anything yet. And by the way, one of her predictions is that a bald eagle is going to attack a politician. So I'm really waiting for that one. Like, I search the news every day, hoping that it's finally become true. But I digress. Let's go ahead and talk about the moment everything seemed like a normal moment until I checked the app formerly known as Twitter to see that the Andrew, formerly known as Prince, had been arrested. Oh my goodness. What is happening? This is so exciting. It was a watershed moment in the history she wrote office. Texts were sent, calls were made, memes were forwarded. People were pointing out that the excitement of it all had made them quite sweaty. But we also discussed the inevitable headlines. Unprecedented, first in 400 years, etc. Before we go any further, I would like to propose a moratorium on the word unprecedented. It does not mean what people who use that word seems to think it means. It's gotten completely out of control. And second, that whole 400 years tripe assumes that the only royalty and nobility that exists in the world is the British royal family. And I assure you, there were a lot of others. Also, let's go ahead and acknowledge the much larger arsenal of spaces to tuck away criminal noble family members in the past. We don't even have to go back at all to find royal adjacent on trial in Norway, where right now the son of the crown princess, stepson of the crown prince, Marius Borg Høiby, is on trial for being a drug-addled sex pest. I have to say, the term sex pest actually sounds too lighthearted. He's accused of rape and violence against women, and also drugs and violating police orders, which means that the stepson of the Crown Prince of Norway was under a restraining order. You generally have to do bad stuff to get slapped with one of those. Usually. But, okay, Marius is a stepson and only royal adjacent. Then we can talk about the long-running saga of the grandson of King Carol II of Romania, Paul Philippe. Paul Philippe is not recognized as part of the royal family of Romania by the royal family of Romania, but he was still able to gain former lands that were royal in Romania and do a whole illegal thing with them. Romania convicted him of corruption in absentia in 2020, and in the time since, he has been arrested and released in France, Malta, in France again, as both countries declined to extradite him back to Romania to serve his time. But all of these are things going on now, not in history. So it's not in our purview to discuss them, nor can anything really be said for certain at this stage of the game. We could talk all about the royals that were imprisoned by the Third Reich. Hitler loved to persecute the nobility, and he absolutely hated some of them more than others. The sons of Franz Ferdinand, for instance, hate. The Archduke whose death kicked off the First World War had 3 children, and all of them were targeted by the Nazis. His 2 sons were sent to Dachau, where According to all reports, they comported themselves with the innate composure that nobility is supposed to show in the face of such circumstances. They did as they were ordered. The most horrible of the tasks, like cleaning toilet pits. They were given less food than the others. They followed the rules without complaint. But that didn't stop them from trying to help others in the camp. Prince Ernst and Duke Maximilian should be a much bigger topic of discussion when the subject of quiet heroism comes up. So, too, should Princess Mafalda, the daughter of the King of Italy, whose mother was a princess of Montenegro. Mafalda was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp because she was acting against the Third Reich behind the scenes. She was intensely brave, and she was killed after the Allied bombing of the Buchenwald ammunition plant. The official Nazi story is that she was wounded so severely in the bombing that medical treatment couldn't help her. Needless to say, there are quite a few people who dispute this. But again, Ernst, Maximilian, and Mafalda were not imprisoned for committing what we consider crimes. They were political prisoners. The honor inherent in their positions and their actions doesn't really apply to the whole Andrew situation. But there is yet another example from the World War II era we can possibly look to, and the British were definitely involved in this one. Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. Paul's father was the brother of the Karađorđević Serbian king, then the uncle of the next king, and then the great-uncle of the Yugoslav king when Alexander I of Yugoslavia was assassinated in France in 1934. Alexander's son Peter became King Peter II, but he was still a child, and Alexander named Prince Paul as regent. Paul didn't particularly want to be regent, which is why Alexander chose him. Paul preferred to hang out in Britain. He loved all things British. He didn't like Belgrade. His wife, Princess Olga of Greece and Denmark, was the sister of the wife of the British king's brother. She was also the first cousin of Philip, who ended up being the Duke of Edinburgh and married to Queen Elizabeth II. Lots of connections. The problem for Paul was that World War II was rapidly approaching. And even though his deepest sympathies lay with what were becoming the Allies, the realities of Yugoslavia's borders were much more problematic. 1/5 of Serbs alive at the beginning of World War I were killed by the end of 1918. It was a horrific number of casualties. Awful. And Germany was still at the border of Yugoslavia. The ever-present agitation of the Bulgaria-Serbia border was yet another problem, and then you can add Italy into the mix. And the Allies weren't tremendously helpful at this point. They weren't yet ready to commit. They had problems of their own. Yugoslavia was not their top priority. So, Paul hemmed and hawed and stalled and tried to delay. He gave a little to try to avoid giving a lot, but eventually the day of reckoning came. In 1941, the Nazis informed Prince Paul that they were going to be invading Greece and they needed to cross Yugoslavia to do so. His tap dance of avoidance was to cease. They needed him to sign the Tripartite Pact and become an official member of the Axis. There was still a lot of drama and attempted avoidance, but eventually Prince Paul saw no other way around the treaty that would keep millions of Yugoslavs from dying yet again in a world war. So on March 25th, he signed. And Yugoslavia was enraged. He was removed from power in a coup d'etat 2 days later on March 27th. Yugoslavia repudiated the Tripartite Pact, and on April 6, 1941, Germany invaded. The war on the Balkan front was horrific. The invasion did, however, delay Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. May have had some effects there. Prince Paul fled Yugoslavia through Greece and was sentenced to house arrest by the British. He was exiled to Kenya and then allowed later to go to South Africa. He was declared an enemy of the state by Yugoslavia after the war. However, he was rehabilitated by the Serbian government in 2011, but he wasn't alive to know that. Okay, so maybe house arrest and exile isn't what is being searched for here. What else do we have? Well, two of the children of the last Grand Duke of Tuscany, Archduchess Louise of Austria and her brother, Archduke Leopold Ferdinand, also had some issues in 1903. Louise was married to Prince Frederick Augustus of Saxony and had 6 children. Leopold wasn't married yet, but he had decided to marry his prostitute mistress. Louise had no end of problems at the Saxony court, where she was a bit too much for the liking of her father-in-law and quite a few of the court ladies. An argument that led to a threat of imprisonment at an insane asylum caused her to bolt. Leopold decided that he too needed to get away from the stifling atmosphere that didn't allow archdukes to marry prostitutes, and the two met up in Switzerland. They talked amongst themselves about staying quiet and unassuming, but it wasn't in either of their natures. The King of Saxony sent German police to Switzerland to arrest Louise, but they were turned back by the Swiss police, who made it very clear that German police did not have authority in Switzerland. The King of Saxony also tried to accuse Louise of stealing certain crown jewels of the state, but when it was discovered that she had actually left these jewels behind, the whole thing was hushed up, and the king quickly created a divorce where one had no legal precedent. But Louise was pregnant, and there was some question as to whose child she was actually pregnant with. The whole thing left her quite exhausted, and so, on the advice of her lawyer, she agreed to check into a nice sanitarium to rest. But that was not quite the sanitarium she was taken to, however. To her horror, she was placed in something very like the insane asylum she had been originally threatened with. She was eventually allowed to leave, however, and went on to Lindau, where she gave birth. But Louise wasn't the only one who spent time in an asylum. Her brother, Leopold Ferdinand, was committed for a time as well. When he originally announced his intention to renounce his title and his place in the succession to marry a prostitute, Emperor Franz Josef placed him in an insane asylum for about 3 months, because that is crazy. It's not a prison, but also it was. It was the prison used for royals when royals were still in charge of most of the world. We could continue going back. There is no short supply of royals and nobility who behaved badly enough that something had to be done. But I think the point has been made. Air Miles Andy or Randy Andy or his buffoon highness or whatever other nicknames he's earned along the way, and not special. He's not so special that he can commit crimes with impunity. Nor is he special in being caught. Which must be a fun realization for an Andrew formerly known as Prince. They're just not special.
What to do